welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And today, Josh and I are going to talk about one of the most important virtues in tennis and arguably in life. It is one of the four cardinal virtues in Stoic philosophy. And what we're talking about today is courage. And it's from an etymology perspective, the word courage comes from the Latin cor, which means heart. And it's really about having the heart to do something, or at least that's the original definition of the word. And very often we associate courage with the ability to overcome fear or to act in the face of fear. And of course, in tennis, there are a lot of things that are going on that could bring up some fear-based reactions. I think to get us started, Josh, I want to share a quote about courage from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the 32nd president of the United States. He said that courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. And I think this really has a direct tie to our experience on the court, whether it be in one match or over the course of your career. And I'd love to, just have you reflect on that quote, as well as, other things that you're thinking about when the word courage comes to mind.
Yeah, I like that. It's not the opposite of fear. It's how fear is responded to. It's how fear is handled, and it requires you to almost like rise above that fear. So it's not, I think sometimes people have this idea of, okay, I'm feeling this fear. That means I can't perform, or that means I'm doomed. And that's not, what I like about that quote is that it shows that, can and will have that fear, but courage is the ability to successfully handle it by rising above it with certain virtues and characteristics that are required to do that.
Yeah. And so Ryan Holiday, who writes a lot about courage, and actually I would recommend his book on courage. So it's called Courage is Calling, Fortune Favors the Brave. And just a really kind of short piece of advice in there was, it's okay to be scared. It's not okay to let that stop you.
Yep.
And I think when we see things on the tennis court, we often see, at a base level, the emotion is fear. There might be different situations that are causing that, but we see that fear stop people from doing the right thing, right? From truly expressing their games in that moment. And I think, just maybe this is a bit of a pun here, but the fear that people like you and I have is that will become habitual. If you are avoiding fear as your normal strategy, that will be tougher to break. And hence, we want to make sure that we talk today about ways of making courage, even just little moments of courage, more habitual so that it becomes easier in those bigger moments. So what are we really applying courage to? We often look at it as maybe a physical act, Josh. But I think we also wanted to talk a little bit more about whether we call it a moral act or an ethical act, maybe an act of sportsmanship or good sporting behavior. It reminds me of another author who writes a lot about Stoicism, Massimo Pigliucci. He has a good book called How to Be a Stoic. And in there, he writes that courage can be physical, but more broadly refers to the moral aspect. For instance, the ability to act well under challenging circumstances. And this is something that comes up in tennis all the time when issues of fairness and honesty and respect and sportsmanship. So I want to make sure we cover some of that as well. And I think one other behavior I'd like to talk about, Josh, in our discussion today is that in many ways, procrastination is an expression of fear, putting off something that we could do today to tomorrow or some other time, or simply using procrastination as a strategy for not wanting to address something or wanting to change. So anything else before we move on to kind of like some of the fears and how to examine those? Any other thoughts just on courage as a concept?
I have another quote,
Sure.
which is actually from Mark Twain, which is that courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear, which I think is in line with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's quote, sort of along those same lines, that it's not that there's no fear and that we're courageous. It's almost that fear gives us the opportunity to be courageous, and that it's, in the face of fear, courage is, just like he said, is the resistance to fear and that mastery of fear. So it's okay, we have this moment, we have this fear that arises, we have this challenging situation in front of us, and courage is us successfully facing that and encountering that. So I like that. And I like this idea of mastery of fear,
Mm.
where it's, and we've talked in the past some about this idea of mastery, and that it's not just focusing on the process, it's trying to master the process. It's not just trying to you know have an in between point routine, it's trying to master that time between points, or or different aspects of the game. And I like this, when it comes to mastery of fear, I think that's trying to essentially handle fear in the best possible way. And yeah, we can talk about some of the different specific situations that can come up within tennis. And, maybe in those tough moments, whether it's ethical situations that arise, and certainly those can in tennis, situations with line calls or rules or things like that. But also, other sorts of fears about, maybe more about how you play, or how you train, or things along those lines. So yeah, I think those couple of quotes are a really good starting point, and I like that you brought up the etymology of the word. And I think sort of from a starting point about the topic, it's important to sort of have that foundation or have that base, and then we can dive a little bit more into some of the specifics around tennis.
So when we think about the things that we might face fear of in tennis, and that would most likely apply to other areas of life as well. But I think one of or I'll go through some big ones I think that players struggle with, depending on their own personality or who they are. Certainly, a fear of making mistakes, maybe not being perfect, a fear of losing, and that's an unpleasant experience. One of the biggest ones, especially for younger players, is a fear of what others will think of them. And sometimes it's a fear of just even yourself, in terms of, am I good enough? Or am I even improving? Is all this work? Has it been worth it? Um, so I think, these are things that are going on out on the court that can become big in our minds. And I think our sort of our base response, maybe our default response to such fear, part of our human survival system, has been one of avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we often see is people will not make a decision to confront the fear through action. They'll usually make a decision to address fear through avoidance, just getting the ball in, avoiding make a mistake, playing not to lose, excessively worrying about what others will think. And maybe even that leads to overconformity in certain aspects of your training or who you are, etc. So I think it's good for everybody to take an inventory of what are your specific fears on the court, because that's a big list. And Josh, you can add to it as well. Um, but not everybody has those all those fears, and not everyone necessarily responds to them in the same way. Because if we look at courage sort of as a virtuous mean, courage is sort of like right down the middle, and so it sort of, and it's on the spectrum of fear. So if there's too much fear that we can deal with, then we might end up in a place of either maybe being cowardly or even apathetic. It can lead us to be that way. If we become maybe fearless, or where there's very little fear or no fear, we can become reckless, and we act as if there are no consequences, even though there are some consequences. So, I don't think fearless necessarily is a great solution to what you're feeling on the court. But we want to be right in that middle, right? Where we understand there's fear. We know that there is some level of consequences, not existential on the tennis court, but there is some level. And then we want to act. We don't want to avoid, we want to act in the right direction. So your thoughts, Josh, on maybe some other fears and the notion of, how to help people create their own inventory.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. I think fear of failure is a really key one, both I guess short term within a match, or approaching a match, and also long term, maybe about somebody's career. I had a conversation recently with a junior player who, was really focused on that college tennis journey. And we see it a lot. I think we see it a lot with people. But this particular player was still a few years out from, from even the recruiting process, and seemed extremely focused on that. And, I think that can lead to fear, that can lead to anxiety, certainly. And yeah, I mean, I think that there's a number of fears. And I think that being able to, fear again gives us that opportunity to overcome it, to be courageous, to have the types of qualities that we want to embody as tennis players and as people. Um, I would say other fears that come to mind. I think there's sometimes a fear of fully putting yourself out there, on the court in a match, fully going for it, because again, that might mean that you don't end up reaching what you're striving for. So I think sometimes there's that fear of like fully going for it or fully putting yourself out there in that way. Um, I think, yeah, that as you mentioned, that fear of what other people think, definitely comes up with younger players, but I think is something that's probably in the back of everybody's minds. Fear of other people's opinions, fear of other people's thoughts, which I think in reality, people aren't actually thinking about us nearly as much as we assume they are. There's this, the spotlight effect, as it's been called, that we all kind of almost imagine there's a spotlight on us, or almost imagine ourselves as the main character of the story, even though that's not necessarily the case. So I think that there are plenty of fears out there, in a tennis context, in a workplace context, in a academic context. But then the question is, what are we going to do about it? And that really is where courage comes in.
Exactly. So before we move on, let's talk about Go Sport. Our episode today is being sponsored by Go Sport, which is a family-owned business in the US that they specialize entirely on gear bags, so racket bags, duffel bags, backpacks for both tennis and pickleball. These products are extremely well made with premium fabrics and materials. They're rigorously tested so that they last for years, and the whole idea is to take feedback from customers and make sure that they're really satisfied with what they are using. So, Josh, this week I was able to play some tennis, use my bag really for the first time with tennis. I did use it for a pickleball tournament. So I was playing with my friend Dave Fish, the former men's tennis coach at Harvard. Got to play at Harvard, so that was fun, and it was just a nice experience with the bag. I haven't had a really good bag in some time. I had told myself I wasn't allowed to have a good bag until I recommitted back to tennis, and now I have one, and it's just like it's so easy to carry around. It's light. It stands up well. It's so easy to organize all of your things in there. So I'm super happy with the bag itself, and would love to hear a little bit how you've used it over the last few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it's been great partnering with Go Sport, meeting Chris and, just sort of hearing about his own journey with creating these bags. And yeah, I love the fact that it stands up. I love all the different compartments and sections of the bag, which I think really separates it from, other bags that I've used in the past. Just what's nice about all the different sections is that it really gives you the opportunity to separate, right? You can have your area for your rackets, you can have your area for clean or dirty clothes, you can have an area for shoes, for new cans of balls, for you can really separate it. And then what's nice about that is that you know as we know, when you're playing during a changeover, you don't have a lot of time. According to the rules, it's generally around a minute and a half. So the last thing you want to be doing is, fumbling through the bag trying to find something. If it's easy to know where things are, if things are separated and organized, it's just so much easier to find them. So yeah. So again, people can check out Go Sport at GEAU sport.com. You can use the code tennisiq10 for 10% off your order. And yeah, we'd encourage you to check them out.
Absolutely. So, as Josh said, please visit gosport.com, GAU sport.com, and get your 10% discount with the discount code tennisiq10. All right, so let's start to talk a little bit about the fears, Josh, and some strategies that players can use. What are some things that you talk about with players who are experiencing one or more of these types of fears?
I think there's different things. I mean, I think self-talk can have a really key role in this process. Both the awareness of self-talk, being able to notice your thoughts, and certainly some of those automatic thoughts that might pop up. So being able to notice them, be aware of them, and then ultimately catch them when you're having them, and maybe when they're not helping you. And I think, meditation can actually have a really key role to help you be observant of those thoughts as they're happening, so that you can get to that point of, being aware of them and ultimately catching them. So I think, that's sort of the first piece of the awareness piece, and then trying to be intentional with your self-talk. And we could talk about ways to do that, but planning out how you want to talk to yourself, how you want to communicate with yourself. I think being ready for the fear that can and will happen out there, right? That there will be big points. That you might feel fear and anxiety during those big points. So I think being able to plan out your response, sort of like, having that specific situation in mind, and having your response planned out, which really includes, using self-talk intentionally. And we can talk about different tools to do that. I think a couple that come to mind are being able to talk to yourself like a friend. So imagining a friend a friend, a teammate, a family member, somebody that you care about in that situation, thinking about how you would talk to them. Or using your coaching voice, thinking about giving yourself specific suggestions mentally or physically. And you can use your own name to sort of activate that. So those are a couple of tools. Also being able to kind of zoom in or zoom out on a situation, just looking at sort of the facts of the situation, looking at it objectively, or taking a step back and kind of putting it into perspective. So self-talk, I would say, is one of those key ways to handle fear. and having both the awareness of it and then some specific ways of talking to yourself planned out in advance so that when the situation arises, you have a game plan. And again, it doesn't mean you're going to handle it perfectly every time because you won't, but at least having that intention, I think, you know, increases the likelihood of talking to yourself in a way that you want to, which I think can ultimately lead to you handling it in the right sort of way and sort of handling that fearful moment with courage.
What you're saying also has a lot of backing from rational emotive behavior therapy, which is really looking at things more from a rational perspective. The voice that is really projecting fear in your mind is more like your subconscious mind. It's sort of the uncontrollable thought machine. It's not always helpful. It's not always rational, not always true what it's saying. And so REBT, or rational emotive behavior therapy, helps us to think about this in more rational ways. And everything you just said, Josh, is really more rational strategies that we can apply to an emotional, reaction from our brain. And that can be helpful. I think the other thing to look at with something like REBT is noticing how our subconscious is talking about the situation. Is it using, say, the language of demand, like you have to win this match, or you can't lose, or you must do this, can't make mistakes? And so it's demanding a specific type of behavior or outcome from you, and realize that you don't have to win. Nothing terrible is going to happen. Of course, we would prefer to win. So this is another way, again, of how we learn to talk to ourselves better, maybe to dial down the fear such that it becomes easier to be courageous in that situation. So yes, we would prefer to win. We don't have to. We would prefer. On the scale of, truly terrible things happening in our lives, making a mistake or losing a match, or even having someone maybe not think great about us, is not that high compared to, there are a lot of other more terrible things most likely that could occur. So that's one good sort of rational approach to bring to it. Then we can look at the different self-talk that we can use in that situation. And of course, that will depend on everybody's own situation, and maybe how you think about demands versus preference, or what you're trying to avoid in certain circumstances. But, for me, I love the coach's voice. I actually like to encompass all of those other people that you put out there, Josh. I like to put them in the coach too. I think your coach should be your friend in some, in the match, in the battle. You need a friend. The coach can help motivate you. They can help give you courage, right? That's what the word encourage means, is to give courage to someone else. And then, of course, they can give you instructions on particular behaviors. I think another framework that we have talked about in a past episode on mental contrasting is WHOOP. So this is a framework from Gabrielle Oettingen. She is a professor at NYU. And so WHOOP, WOOP, stands for wish, outcome, obstacle, plan. So wish is sort of like the goal part of this. So you might have a wish of, I would like to win this match. Okay, that's a nice wish. The outcome is a little confusing, but I think the outcome is really more the benefits of the win. Maybe this would help me toward a particular goal. Maybe this will help me improve, whatever that is. Obstacle is understanding, all right, what are the obstacles? Maybe you're the obstacle. Maybe my own fear is the obstacle. And then we can list those out. And then what's our plan? So if we go into a match understanding that such fears may come up at certain points, just like you were saying, Josh, we could have scripts for those, right? We could have a particular plan, right? So when this happens, so if it's to deuce point, middle of the set, instead of like, oh, I hope I win this point, or I don't want to make a mistake, you can say, all right, I'm going to kick the serve out wide. and then attack the next ball into the open court. It may not work perfectly, but at least that's a decision. It took courage to choose a path to confront that point. And so a framework like Whoop can really help us to come up with plans to overcome or deal with the fear in those moments.
Definitely. No, and I think that's a framework that people can definitely apply. And I think there's other tools that can help us. I think visualizing how we want to handle a certain situation, sort of mentally rehearsing that moment, coming up with again that clear intention for how we want to go about it, can be really helpful, both going into a match and during a match as well. I think going into a match, having again certain situations planned out and sort of having that plan or intention for how you want to handle certain moments, but also going into a point. Okay, yes, we can think about using a routine, using the different steps of a successful in between point routine, and part of that could be a quick, because you obviously don't have a lot of time, visualization for what for what that intention is, for what you want to do in that upcoming point. So I think something like visualization um can make that intention feel a little bit more vivid, can make it feel a little bit more real, can sort of bring it to life a little bit more, so that you have that clear plan. And I think that can lead you to playing in the right way, because it's easy to let that fear, let that anxiety, let the weight of the moment cause you to play scared in a certain way, right? And I think for a lot of people, that means they don't go for their shots. That means that they maybe push. That means that they moonball. That means that they slice. I think the slice. Not that there's anything wrong with using the slice, and I think it's an important tool. But I can think about myself, in moments where I am not playing with courage, where I'm not confident. Um, I overuse that particular shot, and it's my version of playing it safe. It's my version of not taking the chance or going for it or being courageous. It's me backing off of the situation, and I see it with other players too. So I think by using certain things like self-talk or visualization or your routine successfully, um you can really make that decision that you're going to embrace that fear and embrace the moment and play in a certain way, because you know that by playing in that way, that's how you play best. That's what sets you up for success ultimately. That's you playing your A game and sort of making that conscious decision to play your A game, to play your best style of tennis. And I think that decision in itself is a courageous decision.
To expand on your suggestion of visualization, so a few years ago, I was struggling with one particular guy I practice with. And what I noticed in those matches, Josh, was that I would get balls that were, attackable. Like I could come in on them, but I had this thought of like, should I, shouldn't I? And there just wasn't a lot of confidence there. And really, I think one of the ways that we build confidence is through the courage to act, to do something. So, if you're looking to improve your confidence, we want to start maybe by improving your courage. And so what I began to do was visualize those shots and ones that I would come in on. And I would see myself, committing to that ball, slicing it most likely with my backhand and coming in on that, because my backhand slice is probably one of my better
Nothing
shots.
wrong with the slice, by the way. I wasn't trying to
Yeah.
call out that particular shot. For me, when I use
No,
that shot
and you're
too
right. For
much,
most people, it is. Yeah.
yeah.
For a few of us, that's our A game. But what I noticed after doing that visualization exercise is that the hesitation was almost gone when I played this guy the next time. And it's because I had visualized that scenario so many times that when I saw the ball, I just went. I didn't even entertain should I or shouldn't I. I just went. And of course, me playing that way is going to be a better expression of my game than me just kind of pushing the ball back. Or even if I hit it hard, I'm still not putting myself in a good position to end the point at the net. So I think that's a great suggestion, is to look at maybe some of these moments in which you are maybe capitulating a little bit too much to the fear, see how you would like to respond, use visualization over and over again, bring the emotions that you want to have, and see if there's a bit of improvement the next time you go out there. And for me, it didn't really take that long, Josh. It was maybe within the span of a week, I was able to improve that behavior.
Yep. No, I think that's great, and I think it's a helpful tool that we can use in advance, right? You're preparing for situations or moments that are likely to occur. And I think we can all think about, what are some of those moments where that's most likely to happen for us. And we can look back to past matches where it's happened, where we have had fear, we have had, where we, due to that fear, we haven't played in the way that we've wanted to, or we haven't played in the way that where we've been proud of the way that we've chosen to play, and decide to really try to have a clear intention for those sorts of moments, which again could include visualization, which again could include that conscious decision to play in a certain way in that upcoming point. But I think it's the situations themselves are often pretty clear, where maybe it's a certain shot that you struggle with. Maybe it's a big moment in a match, like a tiebreaker or a deuce point, or when it's break point against you. Um, Maybe it's other sorts of situations, but I think it's a useful exercise to think in advance about what some of those moments are, and and plan for it. Sort of plan out your response. And again, doesn't mean you're gonna handle it perfectly every time or win that point every time necessarily. But yeah, having that plan or intention helps you handle that situation with more courage. I think the other thing that I would add to this, which I think is just a good suggestion in general, um, is it's so easy to notice what we do wrong. Especially when athletes are working hard towards, working hard at their game, working hard towards a goal. It's really easy to notice moments where we fall short, where maybe we're not playing as well as we want to, where maybe we miss a shot that we feel like we shouldn't ever miss. But I think, we want to try to make it a habit of, noticing the good and sort of catching ourselves doing things the way that we want to. And I think I think courage is a great sort of application of that. I think we can find chances to sort of pat ourselves on the back and say, hey, good job going for it there. Good job being courageous there. Good job handling that moment, whether it's more of a moment about your playing style and handling that with courage, whether it's an ethical moment that needs to be handled with courage, whether it's maybe, making the right line call, or whether it's, your doubles partner doesn't make the right line call and maybe that needs to be addressed or corrected. Maybe it's other sorts of situations, but I think when you do handle a situation with courage, again, which could be big picture, which could be going into a point, which could be something on the ethical side, being able to recognize that, being able to celebrate that in a certain way, and sort of pat yourself on the back. I think that recognition leads to that being more of a habit and you being able to do that more in the future.
Yeah, I want to talk about how we start building this as a habit. But I also want to zoom out a little bit, Josh, to talk about, like, at a 50,000 foot level, why? Why should we care about courage. And I was thinking about this before we began recording today. And I just wrote down some notes here that, the purpose of courage is really to help you act toward living your best life, even though everything is uncertain. And I think courage also helps us to express our unique talents and skills and strengths to the world. And to highlight that, I wanted to share a quote from Sidney Smith. He's an author from the late 1700s, early 1800s. So when I read the quote, understands the use of men and man versus persons, different time in history. So he said, a great deal of talent is lost in this world for want of a little courage. Every day sends to their graves a number of obscure men who have only remained obscure because their timidity has prevented them from making a first effort, and who, if they could have only been induced to begin, would in all probability have gone great lengths in the career of fame. And I think this speaks to the idea of it takes courage just to get started. And how many of us don't maybe get started? How many of us let the fear do that? And I think I've even mentioned in some of the past episodes, feeling that myself, and just in terms of how I was living, more just sort of floating around and just taking things as they came, but never really acting with courage to a particular thing that I wanted to master. And I changed that, more in my 40s. It started in the 30s with tennis, really pursuing that, but in my 40s, then getting more into sports psychology and a second career here. And obviously that took some courage to quit my job, no income, etc. Yeah, and then trust that something good would occur. And so, like you were just saying, I have to give myself a little credit there, Josh, for doing that. Not everybody would necessarily do that, but I was in a good position too. But if I hadn't just made the decision to get started, we wouldn't be talking today. We'd be in different places, right? So I think we want to make sure we get started. We get started toward living the life we want to lead. And tennis is a great way to practice that because it puts you under constant pressure. It is something that you can always be looking to improve and master. And so it's a great place to practice this, that then we can begin to expand it to outside aspects of our lives. One thing I do recommend to all athletes to start getting better with courage is to practice doing little hard things. And they don't have to be necessarily fearful things. A very simple example is when you go to a store with a big parking lot, park far away. Force yourself to walk. That takes a little bit of courage. It's a decision to do it a little bit harder because it's going to be hard on the court. You're going to have to choose to do the hard thing. The hard thing is often the right thing. So you parking far away, that's good for your health, right? You taking the stairs instead of an elevator, better for you. But what do most people do? They take the easy way. The easy way is often not the right way. So just by interrogating little things in your life day to day, little things, you start to make or build the habit of making decisions to do something a little bit harder, a little bit harder. And again, they may not be super fearful, but now you're practicing understanding you can do hard things. You can make the decision. I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt who said you should do something every day that scares you. That's another way to think about it. We fear easy things, Josh. Maybe it's just a fear of saying hello to somebody. Can we say hello to someone? Can we be the first to say hello or smile or ask how you're doing? These are just little things that get you to practice courage as a muscle, so that we make it habitual. And eventually on the court, we want to have more moments of courage out on the court, such that becomes our way of performing rather than moments of avoidance, of fearing, an outcome that we think might be terrible, but really isn't so terrible. So I think that is something for everyone to think about is can you do little hard things? Can you do little things that kind of scare you each day such that you're building this capacity to act in the face of fear instead of like avoiding saying hello? No, you do say hello. And before you know it, that will become the habit. That will be like, oh, that Josh guy, he's so friendly. He's always saying hi. He's always smiling. Um, and it's true because he's courageous, to do that type of thing. So, what are your thoughts, Josh, on other ways of practicing courage?
Yeah, there's some I know we talked about stoicism in terms of this being one of those sort of four main stoic values, and Ryan Holiday has sort of distilled that into courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. And I know you brought up his book on courage, and I know he has books coming out on the other three as well. I don't think the
So yeah,
other
Justice has come out. He called it
Justice has come
Do the
out.
Right Thing."
Got it. Got
Also, a
it.
very good book.
Uh-huh. But one thing that comes to mind actually, which is I for, there was one of the Stoics who would talk about, almost like putting himself in a position intentionally to overcome certain fears. Maybe that would be like by wearing a ridiculous outfit. And sort of overcoming that fear of, well, what are people going to think? Or what are people going to say if I'm wearing this? And, you know, people have sort of taken that to the next level in terms of, in daily life, like, can you put yourself in little moments of fear and sort of practice overcoming that? And the person's name is escaping me, but I think this was actually from Ryan Holiday's, the Ryan Holiday's podcast where he was talking with somebody, and they said, "Hey, I am almost like making it a habit of putting myself in those fearful situations and practicing those situations where somebody could potentially tell me no." Right. So I'm like asking questions more that I know that the answer is probably going to be no, but I'm sort of overcoming that fear of somebody saying no. And situations that this person included were like, if you're at Starbucks, right, can you just ask for a 20% discount? Right. Again, most likely, almost definitely, the person at the counter is going to say, sorry, but we don't do that here. If you're at a hotel, can you just ask for an upgrade? And again, it sort of trains you to not be afraid of that response. Okay, the worst thing that they can say is no in that situation, and they likely will. But again, you're making it a habit of being courageous in those moments. And again, those might seem like silly, ridiculous situations, and in a way they are. But it got me thinking, can we try to sort of do the same on the tennis court in some way, right? If you are a counterpuncher, can you practice being courageous in certain ways? Can you take time on the practice court and practice serving and volley? Could you, if you like to be really aggressive and serve and volley, could you practice playing in sort of a heavy topspin, higher margin way for a period of time? Um, Again, you're sort of forcing yourself out of that comfort zone and putting yourself in a position where, okay, maybe this isn't your typical way to play. Maybe this isn't your A game, but by getting yourself out of that comfort zone, by not being afraid to fail, you're in a certain way training that virtue of courage. You're building that habit of courage. You're sort of building that muscle of of feeling the fear, accepting it, and deciding to still act. And I think courage really requires that action. It requires that acceptance of the situation. It requires that decision to, to to handle it in a certain way, and then it requires that action. So I think, through practice, we can get better and better at that. And again, it doesn't mean you're going to be you're going to look back at every situation and say I approached that with the courage that I strived for. But again, just like other sorts of habits, it can, we can get better at it over time. It can become more automatic over time, but that happens through putting ourselves in tough situations, whether that's parking a little bit further, as you said, or whether that's not being afraid to get rejected or to hear no at the Starbucks counter, or whether that means putting yourself out of your comfort zone and playing in a new way, or playing with more courage, or maybe it's somebody that struggles going for their shots. And yeah, you can use that time of practice to really go for it. You can use moments in a match where you're up 4-0 or 5-0 in a set to go for it more, and to practice that, and to build that muscle just a little bit more.
A challenging situation that we often face in tennis matches is it's a long match, getting deep, we're getting tired. And I want to borrow a Vince Lombardi quote here. Vince Lombardi, famous football coach from the 50s and 60s in the US. And also Bill Tim uses this quote in The Winner's Creed, is that fatigue makes cowards of us all. And everybody, I think, can identify with how fatigue and tiredness impacts performance, especially mental performance. And I'm only bringing this up, Josh, in terms of this is a moment in which we can choose to do the hard thing. Choose not to capitulate to this fatigue or tiredness, if that's all it is, and instead push through. Make the conscious decision, have the courage to see this match out, because something like fatigue can end up really becoming an excuse when you probably have more in you. It's, a lot of times fatigue and tiredness is more or less like an early warning system that, your body is getting tired, but there's more there. You can overcome this. And so I think that's just a moment for us to be aware of deep in matches, that you not let that convince you to end the fight, that you push through it and look to make yourself proud in the end. But you have to make that decision. And that's one that, everybody has to learn. Some of us are, good at that right out of the gate, that we persist, and maybe we're actually bad at quitting. And there might be times where you should quit. And, but there might be times where we've quit and we shouldn't have. And so I just wanted to bring that one, sort of my last thought on this topic, Josh.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we haven't talked about on this topic. No, I mean, I think we've covered it from sort of different angles, sort of from a foundational standpoint in terms of what is courage, how it relates to fear, and then talked about moments where it can be used, gave some different strategies around that, and yeah, and again, we'd always love to hear from you. Sometimes we'll have listeners who will email us, at tennisiqpodcast at gmail.com, and share things with us, right? Tell us about different matches they've had, or different moments where they feel like they maybe handled it better or not as well, or come up with questions for us. So, if there's certain moments where you feel like you've been really courageous on the court, feel free to, email us and let us know, or vice versa. And I think probably everybody can think of moments where, where they've been more on that courageous side, or not. And again, I think what's key is being able to learn from those moments, being able to be aware of whether we really acted in a way in line with how we want to be, with that courage, or not, and being able to learn from it so that we can improve going forward.
Well, that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. As Josh mentioned, if you have any feedback or questions for us, Please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube. And you can also check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.